Hello, everyone, and this is Kendall, and welcome to Monuments, Memorials, and Memories, the Stories We Tell, a virtual tour of Washington, D.C. through a literary and humanist lens, and this is prepared for the Mellon Mays program at Heritage University. And as part of this program, last fall when we began the series of virtual tours, we talked a lot about what is unseen and how do we, as those in the humanities, as those working in the literary area, how do we unwrap the stories of our monuments and how do we look at what's inside, what's outside, placement, where monuments and memorials end up? So those are some of the central questions that we tackled, as well as thinking about memory being central to human existence and how do we memorialize that? How do we honor that? And what memories get left behind? What is overlooked? And what happens when we forget? You know, much like photographs, so many things, a photograph only tells one story. A monument often tells one side of a story, but there are so many stories if we unwrap them and look underneath from construction materials to the siting. What are we forgetting when we're not telling the whole story of a particular monument or a memory? And also importantly, what happens when we fail to hear those stories that are so important? Because often we think of our grand national monuments, but all of the stories of all those that worked to make it happen are not told anywhere. It's just the person that we're lauding with the monument. And really importantly, because we're at a real crossroads with monuments and memorials in this country, how do we carry the past into the future? So as we begin looking through all of these sites that we're going to be on this virtual tour, try to keep those ideas in mind. And also, how do we define social memory? Because we don't all have the same memories, but how do we collectively come together to honor memories in a better way? And there's a wonderful poet, Myra Sklarou. She's a Jewish poet here in Washington, D.C. And if you'd like the reading list for this program, of course, just contact me. But she has a wonderful poem called Monuments. And one of the most important phrase groups she has in her poem is, in this freest city, say their names. And she's talking really about honoring all those that created the monuments and those that we don't see as part of this process. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Also, some of these sites that we're going to be going to today on the tour will be familiar, others won't be. And it's important to remember that there are thousands of people involved in every single monument or memorial decision here in the DC area and really across the country. There's always a pressure to work somewhat inaccurately because of the number of people and the number of agencies involved. So it's easy to become frustrated. I become frustrated. We all become frustrated with how the government operates. But I think it's also important to remember that with decisions such as these and many of our national decisions, there are so many people involved that we can't see, again, the unseen, that often inaccuracies take place. And we need to work to see how we can make this a better process all around. There's also some background that you probably need to know that we've talked about in another lecture with the Mellon Mays program, just so you understand the context of DC, in that it started out as a 10 square mile city. It no longer is that. In the 1840s, part of the city, the southernmost part, was lopped back off into Virginia. This is pre-Civil War. So right now, today, I sit in Arlington, Virginia, which is just across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. Originally, Pierre L'Enfant was designated by George Washington to design the plan of the city, which works something on a bicycle spoke type system. And the center of the city was always to be the Washington National Mall with the Washington Monument there in the center. Benjamin Banneker did finish L'Enfant's plan after he went back to France, after Washington fired him. And of course, Benjamin Banneker, there's a lot of myth as well as truth out there about Benjamin Banneker. But what we do know is he was an African-American gentleman, worked as a surveyor, mathematician, and he was one of L'Enfant's assistants, but he did finish the plan of the city. So again, from the start, we've got an unseen individual who was really shaping what the city is today. L'Enfant's plan was carried forward by Banneker, and part of that plan was also that no building would be over 160 feet tall within the city of Washington. So this is to focus everyone's attention so that when you're looking skyward, what you're looking at is the Washington Monument and not skyscrapers. So any larger buildings over 160 feet are built across the border in Virginia or across the border to Maryland to the north. So that's just a little bit of background for you, and we'll go ahead and get started. This that we see right here at the beginning, this is the Netherlands Carillon, which was built after World War II, and it's co-located with the Iwo Jima Memorial, which is where we're going to start our tour today. So this is a cold December morning, one of my favorite times to be at Iwo Jima because the sun rises over the monument, and this is an extension of L'Enfant's plan across the river into Virginia. So this sits on a high peak. Well, that's maybe stretching it a little bit. It's sitting on a high hill across the river in Virginia so that it looks out back over the city of Washington. It was supposed to be a symbolic reference to Mount Suribayachi, where this battle took place. The sculpting for this monument began in 1945 and took 9 years to complete. Even today, it's the largest bronze in the world at 100 tons and 78 feet tall. On the monument, which we'll see in just a moment as I walk closer, every battle is inscribed that the U.S. Marine Corps was involved in since 1775. And as I said, this sits on something of a high peak, so to speak. For those of you in Washington State, you know that peaks are, 12 or 14,000 feet tall. Here on the East Coast, we're lucky to get a peak that's maybe 5,000 or 6,000 feet. So this hill across the Potomac, it's about 100 feet above the Potomac. And as I said, it was chosen for its reference to Mount Suribayachi. It is an extension of L'Enfant's plan across the Potomac, and when we come around the corner here, we'll see how it lines up with the Lincoln Memorial and also the Washington Monument in the Capitol. This monument depicts 5 Marines and 1 sailor, 3 of which, so Navy member, 3 of which later died in that battle. And it's important to note, since we are Heritage University, that there were 6 Navajo code talkers at Iwo Jima. 800 unbroken messages helped with this critical victory. And we have some great quotes by Admiral Nimitz on this memorial about uncommon valor was a common virtue. And as you can see, that's the Netherlands Carillon off to the right. And then as I sweep around the monument here, you'll see the Washington Monument come into view and the Capitol just to the left behind that tree. And then the sun reflects in the monument as well. And some of these battles, depending on your age, as you're watching this, you'll recognize some of the battle names as well. Let's have a few moments here to pause and look out over to the city of Washington. This is obviously early in the morning. I believe it was a Sunday, so there's not a whole lot of traffic right now. Normally this would be completely backed up on a weekday going into town. This is a road that I personally take quite often as I'm zipping in and out of town. So there we have the Lincoln Memorial, Washington Monument behind, and then over to our right, Arlington National Cemetery is also located right near this memorial. And this is taken at Christmas time. So at this time of the year, volunteers do put wreaths on every single gravestone in the cemetery. You'll see those as we come around. It's important to note that the Lincoln Memorial, which we won't do a close-up of in this tour today, that broke ground in 1914. It was halted for World War I and then completed in 1922. So I'll just pause for a moment there to talk about that, in that this is the same time that the Lost Cause narrative was really picking up speed all over the South. So we have not only the ground being broken for the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. as the great emancipator, but we've also got that Lost Cause narrative causing many Civil War generals to go up on statues, plaques all over the South. And it's just an interesting juxtaposition that these two narratives were going on at the very same time in very close proximity. So for instance, the capital of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia, which I actually lived in for a number of years, is only about 95 miles to the south. So you've got a lot of clash going on over this particular issue. And now certainly that many of those memorials, monuments to the lost cause, and those generals have come down, including Robert E. Lee just a few weeks ago, this discussion has been going on for a long, long time. The Washington Monument also went up in 1848 is when it began. Uh, Construction wasn't finished till about 1884, and it's important to remember that Eliza Hamilton was instrumental in fundraising to make sure that was completed. And also, as we're starting to begin our walk here into the FDR Memorial, want to put it in context. We're talking about the unseen, that many of these things were built by many of these monuments to our democracy were built by enslaved people. And Michelle Obama, one quote that I've always admired her about for making in 2016 is that, I wake up every morning in a house built by slaves. And it's just important to realize and understand that while a lot of these discussions are now in the news almost every day, these things have been going on for a long time, that people have wanted to have this conversation, and it's necessary. And materials matter. We'll get to more of that in a minute. But anyway, we're going to jump right now into the FDR Memorial, one of our newer memorials. So it's only in that 20-year range in Washington, D.C. And what's important to note about this is we're talking about the unseen and representation, is that the Americans with Disability Act came into law in 1990. However, representation is still lagging for those with disabilities, and the assaults on that legislation continue. So while that was groundbreaking legislation at the time, it is still under assault today. Under every single Congress, something comes up. So this memorial was dedicated in 1997, and it took 40 years from congressional authorization to it actually breaking ground and being completed. And another interesting fact about this memorial is that FDR was originally not pictured in his wheelchair. So if we think about it, this is dedicated in 1997. ADA has already been law for 7 years. However, the original vision for this monument was not to have him in a wheelchair. He is now in a wheelchair, but that was added in 2001. So that was after the fact, and after lots of serious concentrated lobbying from disability rights groups here in DC and around the country. So I keep saying it's important to remember, but if we're thinking about the unseen and all the people that go into creating every single monument and all the controversies that surround every single memorial or monument, we have to show up. And I'll repeat that as we go throughout the lecture. It's important that if you see something that doesn't sit well with you, you have to speak up and you have to become involved. And I'll leave it at that for a moment as we enjoy this. So this monument has many famous quotes from FDR. There's also a section that's dedicated to Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife. And it's a beautiful monument. I highly suggest visiting it at night when it's well lit and the stars are out. Makes for a great visit. So this highlights all of the work that went into the Works Progress Administration. These are actually bas-relief from a variety of artworks done during that time. And just remember, thousands of people are involved in making this actually happen and come to fruition. Other controversy around this monument was some people, those that lobbied, didn't want to show just the abject poverty that the country was stricken with at that time. But prevailing sensibilities led us to the beauty that this is, this monument, and that we actually show what the depth of despair that the country was in at that time. So from this, I really want you to take away the idea that representation matters, and we just need to work to make sure that we're all seen. Now, this monument, FDR, is located right next to the Martin Luther King Memorial, which we'll go to next. And what's interesting is some of the design choices that were made, in that in FDR, we have a lot of inscription of a lot of his famous quotes. We have the same at the MLK Memorial. So that helps to tie them together since they're co-located around the tidal basin in the shadow of the Washington Monument. But we have the words of two great men highlighted in stone. So the Martin Luther King Monument was dedicated in 2011 and authorized by Congress in 1996. So as you see, we're picking up speed just a little bit, and then we're getting from initial idea and approval and design work to actually being dedicated. The importance of the location of this is not just that it's next to the FDR Memorial, but the address is 1964 Independence Avenue, which is, of course, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This also continues Law and Fawn's plan for the city as it's co-locating monuments, and yet no matter where you are here, you're also looking back toward the Washington Mall and toward the Washington Monument. So in this monument, we see the inscriptions in stone on the wall as well, and the actual depiction of King, which we'll get to in just a moment, is King is the mountain of despair, and passage in the middle is the stone of hope. And this comes from the I Have a Dream speech. And walking through the two sides of how King's image is split is a simulation of the struggle. And I point out the address in particular, 1964 Independence Avenue, in that this is not written anywhere on the grounds here of the monument, the memorial. However, if you do research and you can look through the National Park Service information and that sort of thing, you can find it. But this is just one more piece of information that makes this location incredibly important, but not easily findable as far as documentation. Okay, and from here we're going to cross the street after we do one more look at some of the work, that the inscriptions here that are on the stone that surround this monument, and then we're going to be heading over to the Vietnam Women's Memorial. And certainly feel free to stop this video at any time, just hit pause, and you can read these quotes in more depth. Okay, and here we are just across the street heading to the Vietnam Women's Memorial. This was added in 1993. The original Vietnam Memorial was designed, of course, by the Vietnam Memorial. The original was designed by Maya Lin in 1982 through a design competition. Of course, there was a lot of controversy about her winning that as an undergraduate student, and but then, of course, it's built, and it's one of the most perhaps not important monuments that we have here, but one of the most of the people monuments, and that's from my own perspective. And that one of the most moving times I ever visited this monument was with my father, who then began doing shading sketchings of people that he knew that were on the monument there. So it's important to note as we talk about the idea of inside, outside, seen, unseen, that the women's memorial here, this is the first women's memorial in Washington, and it is off to the side. And while it's co-located, it is important to note that the women's names are on the wall. Most folks don't realize this, and that is, it's not advertised anywhere, but you can find women that died in the Vietnam War on the wall. There is now the Women in Military Service to America Memorial at Arlington Cemetery, but that came several years, at least 7 or 8 years after this initial statue was added to the Washington Mall. So this is dedicated to all those nurses, doctors, associated roles, women that worked in any way. Of course, this highlights the role of nurses and doctors, but this is for all women that served in that conflict. What I like most about this is it shows the women supporting each other, which is often a role we think of for women, but just that they're hanging on to each other and they're working collaboratively, collectively to try to save this soldier and try to save themselves at the same time, because obviously they're in an incredibly dangerous situation. And now we're going to head across town. So if we were actually out walking today, this would be kind of a sprint and several subway rides away. But we're going to head to the African American Civil War Memorial, which is in a neighborhood that's historically been an African American neighborhood where if you're going my Langston Hughes tour, this would be close to the home of Jesse Fawcett. This would really be in the footsteps of Hughes, which was what that tour was quite a bit about. And those African American poets and writers that really shaped a good part of Washington, D.C.'s history. This was dedicated in 1997. There were 200,000 African Americans that served, and all the names are listed on plaques here. Now, it's very similar in that way to the Vietnam Memorial down on the mall. But when I first found this, obviously you have to go looking for this. This is not on the mall. It's in a neighborhood. It's in a busy neighborhood that's now very mixed. It's right at the base of a metro station as well. But here's where we get, again, the idea of seen and unseen. This is off the mall. You have to want to go find this unless you're on a specialized tour, perhaps. It might be included. I've not seen a whole lot of that, but this also highlights the role that, African American men are going off to war. Women are still left at home with children. It's a very difficult situation, obviously, but just thinking about they're going off to fight for a country that they're not fully part of. So the separation takes on a whole new level of anxiety and political meaning at the same time. Again, it's not on the mall. So we have to be willing to go out into the neighborhoods and look for this. And in general, tourists probably aren't going to find their way here. Very meaningful for the people of the city, of course. However, because Washington D.C. was a huge mecca for African Americans after the war, certainly after emancipation. However, we have to go looking for history. We have to go find the meaning, and we have to peel away those layers. So if we're looking at this through a storytelling lens, we can't know the full story until we do the hard work of going to find that which is meaningful to others and not just ourselves. And obviously the scale of this is much smaller based on its location in part, but also just it's not on the mall. So we're going to walk just about a block here over to the Duke Ellington Memorial. So this is through a standard DC row house type neighborhood. If you wanted to ask me, these are small row houses on this. This might be 2 bedrooms, might only be one, probably 1 bathroom. These have been here. These are probably late 1890s row houses. Lots of gentrification going on in these neighborhoods. Pluses and minuses to that, of course. A lot of displacement going on as prices skyrocket. So that 2 bedroom, 1 bath row house probably goes for upwards of $800,000 or more, depending on its condition and level of refurbishment and renovation. So it's important. So this is the very same neighborhood that I was just talking about, the footsteps of Langston Hughes and Duke Ellington. It's also close to one of his teenage homes. He lived in a number of places here in D.C., and there's a wonderful high school of the arts named after him in his honor here in Washington, D.C. This would be the LeDroit Park neighborhood. All kinds of African American feminists lived in this neighborhood, community leaders. And the important thing, it's also near Howard University, this neighborhood. When we get to the statue, it's dedicated in 2012. It's a smaller scale. Again, it's in the neighborhood. You have to go looking for it. If you live in this neighborhood, then you would walk past it every day. However, if you're just here on your average tourist tour, you're probably not going to see a bunch of these sites. It's placed in the shadow of the Howard Theater with its proximity to the university. And it's also a skyward looking memorial as well because music uplifts. And that's one thing that Duke Ellington always said about his music and other music and composers of his time, that music is meant to uplift. It's also meant to liberate. So in looking skyward, at least the eyes can feel liberated and the ears can feel liberated, even if our bodies do not. And from here, we're heading over to the Emancipation Statue and that of Mary McLeod Bethune. Most people have not heard of Mary McLeod Bethune, but this memorial was dedicated to her in 1974. So right now we're just behind the Capitol, so maybe about 10, 12 blocks from where we just were. Mary was the daughter of slaves, and she founded the National Council of Negro Women. She was a seminary graduate, but because of her time, so she died actually in 1955. So this would have been in the late 20s. She couldn't find a church, so she became an educator instead and founded the University of Florida called the Bethune-Cookman College, which is now the is the basis for our historically Black colleges. She was very active in women's rights, and a lot of attention now is on everything that the suffrage movement left behind and that those that have not been honored. But Mary was very much a feminist, very much involved in early civil rights movements, and she became friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, which led to her position as actually an advisor to FDR. So if you think about, we've got the big FDR memorial downtown on the mall at the tidal basin, and then we've got one of his advisors with memorial way off the mall. However, anyway, so she's an advisor to FDR, and actually Truman eventually appointed her to attend the founding of the United Nations Conference in 1945. So she was very active, very well respected, and very hardworking woman. But she's one that she's not in our history books, right? She's not taught. We don't learn about her unless we really go looking for her. And again, feel free if you'd like to study these quotes, feel free to stop the video anytime. And if we were here at this monument today, we would tour these few close to the Capitol and then take a walk around the Capitol and the Library of Congress and all of those buildings that you're probably very familiar with. So again, it's always important to remember that we're often in the shadow of what we've all deemed as greatness. And there's just as many stories hiding in plain sight. And as we walk across this park, we're going to come to a statue called Emancipation. So it pictures Abraham Lincoln with a slave uh, enacting the idea of what the artist envisioned as emancipation to look like. However, this statue is probably going to come down soon. It's in the news a lot. There's a lot of controversy around, but you'll see why as we get closer. Just the positioning of where Lincoln is positioned, where the enslaved person is positioned as he's about to get his freedom, and just how that is depicted and how that's not really the narrative we want to see happening right now. Definitely shows the white man lording over the black man, and that the white man is the path to freedom. And while on the surface, certainly Lincoln had to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, today we're really looking at trying to be more conscious, I think is the best word, of how to honor all of those involved in the struggle and all of those that led to the Emancipation Proclamation, and not have this This one just reinforces the master-slave narrative and working to get away from that. So there probably will be a replacement, but first, all the decisions, like I said, thousands of people involved in every decision, have to get to a decision to actually bring this one down. But it's coming, I would estimate, in the near future. And now we're going to head over to the Women's Memorial, the Belmont Paul House. But I want to first swoop. So to our left there, we had Library of Congress, and then we've got the Capitol. And as we turn and head toward the Belmont Paul House, I just want to point out that this is one of the most haunted blocks in D.C. Or so it said. I've never seen a ghost here or felt the presence of a specter myself. However, the Judge Advocate General that Joseph Holt, his home was on this block, and he was the judge who sentenced the conspirators in Lincoln's assassination to death. One of which, of course, was Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the U.S. government, which we could do many tours on Mary Surratt and Lincoln's conspirators. But we're going to swing around here to the Belmont Paul House, which was burned by the British. Here it is right across the street, burned by the British in the siege of the Capitol in 1812. Alice Paul was the founder of the National Women's Party in 1916, and as I said, they're in this organization also houses the National Organization for Women. They're doing a lot of work on bringing to light the stories of those that have been previously overlooked by the feminist movement. And anyway, Alice Belmont was also president of the party, National Women's Party, from 1920 to 1933. Alice was arrested 7 times in the U.S. and Britain, and if you followed the suffragette movement at all, generally women when they were jailed, they were beaten, force-fed. The details are pretty gory. And here in this area, they would have been sent to a workhouse down in maybe about 20 miles away. And as we all know, the vote for women came in 1920. And now we're going to head over to one of the newest memorials, only was built last year, was dedicated November 11th of 2020, approved by Congress in 2013. So as you can see, our speed is really ramping up at this point. So this is on the grounds of the National Native American Museum on the Washington Mall as part of the Smithsonian Institution. This memorial was designed by Harvey Pratt, who is Cheyenne and Arapaho, also a Vietnam vet. And water is one of the main design features. And this is one of the most peaceful memorials that I've seen come to be here in Washington. It is in the shadow of the Capitol. And it's important to note also about the museum here that John Paul Jones, who's Cherokee and Choctaw, is a Seattle architect at the firm of Jones and Jones. He was the first architect awarded the National Humanities Medal. And since you're closer to Vancouver, BC, there at Heritage, the Land Bridge Project with Maya Lin, designer of the Vietnam Memorial, is in Vancouver. So that's a nice road trip as well. Again, this is just to show you that everything focuses back to the Washington Monument. Everything's in the shadow of that monument. Okay, and now we're going to zip way across town and we're going to head up to Embassy Row. And we're going to pause here for just a moment at the monument to Nelson Mandela. So he's standing in front of the South African Embassy with a raised fist, and this will be important to note in just a few moments. Winston Churchill is placed across the street at the British Embassy. So originally, the South African Embassy was built in its location because it was a part, it was a, I always lose my word on this one, but as a colony of Britain, it was placed across the street. So excuse my stumble there. So Winston Churchill is placed here across the street. Obviously, this statue was here first. So he has his hand raised in a V for victory. And if we go back to Nelson Mandela, he has his fist raised because rock, paper, scissors. Rock always crushes scissors. So hence freedom, well, symbology going on that you have to dig for that piece of information as well, of course. But if we're going to talk about there's always more to the story than just a statue on the street. So reinforces that call and response. The relationship of South Africa today to Britain is obviously much different than when these embassies were built, and the addition of Mandela's statue with the raised fist emphasizes that. So when we're looking at statues, we always have to look for the little clues, and we have to ask a lot of questions, because if we're going to get to what is unseen and who's inside, who's outside, and what the relationships are, if you're just walking down the street, you might just say, well, that's Nelson Mandela with his fist raised. But until we know that it was designed in response to the statue across the street, that meaning would be lost. And as we walk up Massachusetts Avenue here, we're heading to a wonderful memorial to the Lebanese American poet Khalil Gibran. He was a poet of wisdom. He was in the Romantic period, but he's often maligned for being too common, perhaps. This memorial was dedicated by our first President Bush, who said, perhaps his greatest bequest was the key by which we opened our own imaginations. So sometimes, even if poetry isn't deemed to be high or our stories aren't deemed to be high, there's still value. And we need to look for that, particularly as humanists, particularly as those interested in literature. And by 1991, 8 million copies of his book, The Prophet, had been published in the United States. However, he's not listed in any poetry anthology because he's just too mainstream. And here we're going to quickly run across Massachusetts Avenue and walk across town. Like I said, you're getting your workout today. We're going to head on to the campus of Georgetown, and we're going to go visit a statue of a man named Jan Karski, who you've probably never heard of. But Georgetown, one of the oldest campuses in the country, is going through a great deal of work on reparations right now, as many of these buildings were also the most historic of the buildings. There's lots of modern work here too. Were built by enslaved peoples, so they are involved. They're one of the first universities in the country to really take this head on and figure out what their history is and what their relationship needs to be with those involved in that history going forward. It's a rocky road, as to be expected. However, they are making some strides in their efforts and trying to unravel their history, which is really what we're doing when we try to tell stories. We're trying to unravel history because it's remembered publicly in one way, and yet there's always that backstory that takes that work to go find. So we're going to walk across campus. This statue of Mr. Karski was dedicated in 2008. He was a longtime professor at Georgetown in the history and government departments, taught for about 40 years. He was a Polish Catholic officer who escaped Soviet detention and torture. The details are gruesome, but if you're interested, I have several books that I would recommend to learn more about him. He was a member of the Polish underground. He took many risky missions across Europe, traveled to England and the US, and he was the first eyewitness account to the atrocities of the Holocaust. And in 1943, published the book Story of a Secret State. He met with FDR at that time, but those warnings were unheeded. So again, he's trying to bring the story of what we're not seeing in the United States media at that time, what is not being discussed openly by any means, that ultimately led to the death of over 6 million Jewish members of our world. And had his warnings gone heeded, perhaps the result could have been slightly different. However, he was not listened to, and we all know the result of that. So his statue sits on a quiet bench in a corner of the campus with a chessboard, because that was one of his favorite pastimes. One of the things that he always told his students was, all murdered Jews are my family. I'm a Christian Jew. And for me, that really represents what we're talking about today, which is how do we make those that are unseen seen? How do we make sure that our stories are more accurate? How do we make sure that we're getting to the root of history, even if it's uncomfortable and we've never learned it before? He did win the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which was given to him posthumously by President Obama. And we're going to end our tour today back across the river in Virginia at the Virginia Theological Seminary and Episcopal Seminary. And this is a really important statue as we're talking about seen, inside, outside. This was dedicated in 2015 on the grounds of the school in the Chapel Garden, which was this area was originally built in 1881, and it sits on a hill overlooking Washington's other monument, which is a Masonic monument temple in Alexandria, Virginia. And the artist Margaret Parker Adams is known for her religious and social justice work, and she really wanted, and the seminary directed her to design a true representation of Mary and Martha, which as it's come to fruition, and she took that message, that what the university wanted, what the seminary wanted, and by the nature of her own work. So Mary and Martha are actually pictured as African American women. I'll pause here for just a moment. Instead of white women. So this is a completely different narrative if we're looking for the story here of what they would have looked like. So Mary's sharing her news of the visitation and the design, because it's an eye to eye instead of on high, which is where many of our monuments and memorials are placed. They're looking toward the sky. It was a conscious decision by the artist, Margaret Adams, to put it on an eye level so that we could see and be part of this story. So we're taking the story from being on high. Not only is it a religious story, which just leads us to think of on high, but we're putting it into a human scale so that it's more not only human, but so the experience of joy is that which can be shared, instead of just looking past some traumatic moment in time and looking beyond. So it brings it to make us part of it, part of the experience. So I'll leave it there with that message of representation, and knowing that we all have to look for those messages, and finding memories requires work, finding stories requires work, and unwinding history requires a lot of patience and a lot of time. Well, here we are at the end of our tour, and as we've wrapped up here with Mary and Martha, I just want to leave you with a few final thoughts. And you've been really patient, and you've walked a great long distance today, probably close to 10 miles or so, as we've gone on this virtual tour. But I really want to circle back to the idea of the stories we tell and the seen, unseen, and the fact that I say it's important so often. And that comes up for me personally because there's just so much to unpack with this issue. The Mellon Mays Foundation is doing a lot of work on this issue right now, as are many people around the country. And I would say probably no more so here than here on the East Coast. We have just so many monuments that are in question right now. So because we work in the humanities, and those of us that love and work in literature, it's really, again, important that we, work to really uncover the untold and the unseen, which is why I keep coming back to that idea throughout the tour. And inside, outside, where do we place things? Who gets to be placed where? Who makes the decisions? And if you're not part of that decision-making process, then of course we all end up excluded from that process. So I really encourage you to get involved on a local level, and whatever monuments, memorials might be coming to the fore in your own community, because it's really important to bring our voices to the table. Also, as those working in the humanities and humanitarians, our job really is to work really on hearing and not just listening. This is part of, the work that we're doing to uncover what's untold, unseen, and trying to figure out how we bring the outside in and change what the meaning of inside really is. It's also important that we share what we find. Hence, this is part of why I'm talking to you today, because this is, part of my daily life right now, living right in the DC area. It's important that we talk about what we're all experiencing, what we're finding, and talk about the people we're meeting and how they might influence future decisions and how maybe you can be part of influencing a future decision. And the photo that I have here on this final slide of the day is of the COVID memorial that was only on the National Mall for several weeks. And every day that I went, the number just went up exponentially each day. And we talked earlier a little bit about how some monuments or memorials might be more of an ethereal kind. They may not be permanent, while most of what we saw in the tour today are more of the touchable kind, whether it's Mary and Martha, where we're at the eye view of a memorial, or whether it's looking at something large like the Lincoln Memorial or the FDR that are tangible, that we can reach out and touch for extreme amounts of time, for hundreds of years, while others are fleeting. And it doesn't make them any less important, or they shouldn't resonate any less with us just because they're not of a permanent nature. And sometimes the ethereal monuments and memorials are those that impact us the most. It's also really upon us to think about that beauty and pain are going to coexist in absolutely every discovery we make in the humanities. And particularly as we're working in this area of monuments, memorials, who gets memorialized, who doesn't get memorialized, who has been excluded, and who's been turned away, we really come to understand that beauty and pain, they coexist. And it's our job, since we work in literature and humanities, to think about how we can honor all stories. So I leave you with that thought, and I hope you've enjoyed the tour. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to contact me anytime.